Hey everyone, thank you for joining us for the inaugural episode of Faith in the Folds, a podcast for ministry, biblical studies, and Christian living. I'm your host, Kevin Burr. On the night of March 2nd and early morning of March 3rd, 2020, Middle Tennessee was rocked by a series of tornadoes ranging in strength from EF3 to EF4. As if almost in a line running parallel with Interstate 40, portions of Nashville, Mount Juliet, Lebanon, and Cookeville, Tennessee, as well as other townships, were absolutely devastated. Winds in Cookeville reached up to 175 miles an hour, and the property damage in all the areas affected by the storms totaled into the billions of dollars. I grew up in Middle Tennessee, and basically everyone I know who still lives back home either experienced some kind of loss or knows someone who did. A church less than half a mile down the street from my parents' house, the house I grew up in, was basically destroyed, and it seems like almost everyone on the eastern side of Nashville and farther east has a similar story. These days, that property damage is harder to come by, but can still be seen if you know where to look. The real cost, however, was the human cost. On the one-year anniversary of the storms, I wanted to sit and listen to minister John Nichols reflect on the impact of these storms in the community and the church he works with. John has been in congregational ministry for 16 years and has served for the last 2.5 years as the preaching minister for the College Side Church of Christ in Cookeville, Tennessee, the epicenter of last year's storms. John, thank you so much for joining us today on the inaugural episode of Faith in the Folds, a podcast for ministry, biblical studies, and Christian living. I am glad to talk with you today about something that is going to be on a lot of people's minds here in the next few days. The tornadoes that struck Middle Tennessee back in 2020 almost seemed like they didn't get their fair shake, because it was just a week or so after that we ended up, not just Middle Tennessee, but really the rest of the country ended up having to go into the initial stages of quarantine. And so the tornadoes were coming around to their first anniversary. And I'm sure that there are a lot of folks who are wondering, wanting to take a look back, what has happened a year later, to help us kind of set the scene for what happened during that time and what has happened since then. Can you kind of walk us through the initial day or days immediately following those tornadoes?
I'd be happy to, and thanks so much for inviting me on. I'm honored to be talking with you specifically, but also anybody out there watching or listening. Early Tuesday morning, March the 3rd, 2020, will forever be in my memory. My wife and I had gone to bed the night before, knowing that there would be some opportunity for some significant weather. Certainly, we didn't ever dream that what would happen would actually happen. And so she woke me up where I live. I've got 3 small boys and a wife, and it was just about 2 miles as the crow flies from where the storm hit the hardest in the Cookeville area. And if you're not familiar with the geography of Tennessee, that's about halfway, give or take, between Nashville and Knoxville. And we knew early in the morning, around 1:45, 2 o'clock in the morning, something significant was happening. We could just hear it. And so we went to our basement, and not too much later, I received a phone call from someone who lived in the neighborhood that was hit the hardest. And from the tone of his voice, I knew that it was a tragic situation. And so, threw some clothes on and got into my pickup truck and drove into town, and then spent the rest of the day that day at the hospital, and with a host of others. Um, in a way, well, I don't mean to say it that way. I am profoundly thankful that COVID had not shut everything down at that point. We were still about a week and a half from the national shutdown, lockdown, and so with many other people spent all day at the hospital. And as the hours passed on that day, the reality began to set in, that lives were lost, that homes had been obliterated. I mean, just not there anymore. Not two pieces of wood stuck together. And so we began to really feel the weight of the experience, and the church that where I work, we felt it especially hard. That sting was especially potent, and it was of the hardest day of my life. And then the days that followed, obviously, all of the things that had to happen, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But that kind of gives you an overview of the events of the day, for sure.
Yeah. Middle Tennessee covers a pretty wide geographic range for those, like John mentioned, who not necessarily familiar with the geography of Tennessee. Um, Split up into kind of the three distinct regions: east, middle, and west. And middle can cover anything from like an hour and a half west of Nashville to an hour and a half east of Nashville, and Cookeville falls comfortably in that range of it's about 75 miles down the interstate. You mentioned homes and just the destruction of property. My parents live on the eastern side of Nashville, and a church not half a mile down the street was just ripped in two. My mom had been in that building earlier that day or the day before. And so there's a lot of folks across a very wide area that experienced that kind of experienced the same kind of destruction that you did. John, this is you mentioned that it's that you were almost glad, and I think I understood how you meant it, that you were almost, it was almost a not necessarily a good thing, but you're almost glad that COVID hadn't hit yet in the way that it had, because as a minister, you felt a real need to be with people in the hospital, and not just you as a minister, but I mean people from all over, just regular church members, church leaders, not just at your church, but across the city, felt a real need to be with people.
Right.
Let me ask this though. I mean, after that, what changed about how you did church? Did you preach a different series? Did you decide, man, we got to switch gears because we got to address this? What actually, a year, like looking back a year later, what changed?
Well, everything, and I know that is cliche, but it really is true. So just a little bit of further background to maybe to give some context for our specific situation. The Sunday before, I stood on the stage at the College Side Church of Christ with a shepherd, and we laid out a vision for our church. And part of that vision was, obviously related to our church body local in Cookeville, but also the fact that we wanted to plant churches and do some missional things and just really take a step forward in faith. And so that happened just the Sunday before Tuesday, March the 2nd. So that day happened, I knew immediately that the following Sunday we were not going to continue our vision series.
Yeah.
I mean, that just wasn't going to happen. And so felt, some conviction and some direction through the word and through people around. And so talked about, hope and peace and the love of God and those kind of things. And then immediately, I mean, the very next Sunday, we had half our audience because COVID began. And then the immediately following that, the very next Sunday, we didn't have in-person gatherings at all for several months. And so I jumped into First Peter, and that was for a lot of different reasons. But one of the things that struck me about Peter was the audience being exiled and the nature of being separated. And obviously, Peter's audience is very different from the first world American audience in Cookeville, Tennessee. However, we were separated at the period of time when we needed each other the most.
Right.
And so, we jumped into a different series in a different way, certainly, and but found comfort in the Word in a way that we hadn't previously.
Yeah. First Peter is like you said, its target audience is addressed to folks that Peter describes as any number of terms are pretty useful. Refugees, aliens, sojourners, exiles, all of those are pretty accurate translations of what Peter describes there. And you're right in a lot of ways. Some people were literally without homes.
Right.
I mean, like you'd mentioned, some buildings had a lot of homes, especially not two pieces of wood stuck together.
One of the things that still sticks out in my mind about that series and around the context of the original audience is that many of those folks who'd been in and around Jerusalem at the beginning of the church, when the church was started, were in places they never thought they would be. And metaphorically, for us, while we all still lived in the same hometown, emotionally, mentally, we were in places we never thought we would be, and having lived through what we lived through 2 weeks previous, and literally seeing news crews surround our town for 2 weeks and then being at home, it felt fitting, and obviously didn't plan on that, but believed the Lord had a hand in directing that for our church body.
Yeah. Peter goes on to say, especially in chapter 2 and around the middle part of chapter 3, that he goes on to stress the importance of their unity in the face of this adversity. Now, the adversity that they were facing might be a little bit different from what y'all were facing. It wasn't necessarily a natural disaster, but it's Peter's message still rings true that y'all were in a place where you never could have reasonably expected to be, and your unity as a group, as a church, and even as a city, was was all the more necessary. Yeah. You had one Sunday where you were all back together, and then another Sunday where half of your membership was justifiably concerned about COVID.
Sure.
So we just didn't. A year ago, we didn't understand it like we do now.
Right.
And then after that, churches in Tennessee were asked to close temporarily. How much did COVID exacerbate the conditions left by the tornadoes?
I don't think it can be overstated. We were not able to grieve in the way we would have. Certainly there are ways that we would have grieved in my mind had we had quote normal times. I don't know that. I can't speak authoritatively on that. However, I do believe that there are many things that we would have done that we just weren't able to do.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the biggest thing, the biggest theological truth, the biggest practical truth, the biggest truth that I've experienced just in ministry practically, that has really come home in my own thinking, in my own mind, something that I want to do better in ministry moving forward over the last year has been the need for community, for connectivity, for spiritual family. And I don't think it's by chance that when our leadership met December of 19 and then January and February of 2020, talking about our church vision, that the first concept that we wanted our people to really know was that we want to be a family. And so we were going to kind of cut against the grain. We were not going to move to multiple assemblies. We didn't really want to build a big space necessarily. We've experienced some growth, but we wanted to keep that family identity that has been so special at the College Side Church for so long. I don't think it's by any chance that was what was on our hearts, because that's what we needed the most on and after March the 2nd. It's what we need the most now. And so COVID took away at least the practical application of family.
Right.
But COVID did not kill that, because very quickly we figured out ways to connect and ways to touch in ministry ways one another. But there's no doubt that we had to, right on the fly, as I'm sure all church leaders have had to, figure out how to stay connected. For us, the stakes were that they felt incredibly high because we needed one another so much.
Yeah.
And so not being able to be together obviously takes away one of the greatest opportunities for that.
Yeah. It's fascinating to me that you you mentioned how in December of 2019 and then January and February of 2020, the leadership there at the College Side Church is already having conversations about how you want to fully embrace your identity as a church family, and how you can continue to support and bolster and engender that that identity as a church family when, a week later you have these tornadoes hit and then COVID hits. Something that I've seen kind of happen through this last year, and John, I'm sure you've seen it as well. And many of our friends and associates in ministry have seen this as well. That God seems to be preparing us for things even before we know we're going to need that.
Amen.
Have y'all seen that happen at College Side, especially this last year?
I don't know who said it first. It's certainly not me. I think
we can quote you here and now, though.
one of our administrative assistants has got this on her wall. God doesn't call the equipped; He equips the called. Yeah. You've heard something along those lines. I can't tell you, Kevin. I cannot tell you the number of ways that I've seen that put into practice. And we had, I'm going to say pushback, but I want you to understand when I say that we had some pushback to the family kind of thrust of our vision. It wasn't from like a negative perspective, we didn't have people saying, "Oh, we don't want to be a family," but we did have people saying, "Why is that number one?"
Sure.
Right? We need to either build a bigger building or increase the size of our campus, or we need to go do outward things first.
Mhm.
And I'll tell you, the Lord, there was again a group of us on our leadership that had those conversations, and we just felt convicted. And I don't know the better word other than that,
Mhm.
that family needed to be first, because if in fact we were going to do some outward based ministry, if we were going to try to transform some things outside of these walls with the Lord's help, we needed to be who we needed to be first. The foundation matters.
Mhm.
And there were even times I doubted that myself, but I'll never doubt it again.
Yeah.
And so, I've always believed, in reading the word, and have seen that God helps those even before they know they need help,
Yeah.
in preparing them for what it is they're going to face. But I'll be real honest with you, I had never experienced it quite like that. It's not that I didn't believe it. It's just that I never experienced it quite like that personally,
Mhm.
to then rely so heavily on family. There was, if you got any psychologists that listen to this, um, they'll probably be able to psychoanalyze some of
Yeah.
this. But one of our other administrative assistants brought me something just to my office a week or two ago, and we're now, as we're filming this, we're preparing for the 1-year memorial service that we're going to have here at our church, on our church campus, in a couple of days.
Mhm.
And she brought me something to edit. It's one of my informal jobs, is I edit much of our communication.
You have
I'm an
your red
English.
pen stashed away back there on your desk?
I actually always have one on me.
Oh, there you go.
I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to language and words and that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
But anyway, I read it and made some changes, and after I read it, she asked me. She said, "Do you know what this is? Do you know who wrote that?" And I said, I don't have a clue. Whoever it was, they forgot this punctuation and whatever. Well, it
I
was
don't think
me.
I want to know who wrote
That's
it.
right. It was me.
Wow.
I had written that 2 weeks after the storm in 2020. It was a church-wide communique that we had sent out when we were fixing to close down some things, and some things we needed to communicate to our church. And I think it ended positively and all that. But Kevin, I'll tell you, I had no recollection of it.
Wow.
None. And I still don't. I don't remember writing it. And not only did I write it, but I also, I spoke it at the last assembly before we closed down,
Mhm.
and then recorded it for all of our social media platforms. I mean, I wrote it, sent it out in the mail, and then spoke it twice, and I have no recollection of it.
What do you make of all that?
Well, I believe that as I look back over that 6-week period, and really even more than that, but specifically to isolate that 6-week period, that the Lord was a step ahead,
Mhm.
not just in my own life, but in all of our staff, in all of our leaders, our elders, our ministry leaders. I believe the Lord was out front.
Yeah.
And he was carrying us through what we could not get through on our own, and providing for us. And I know in our fellowship, in the past, not so much now, there's some uncomfortableness around some of that, and I don't know what to make of all that theologically, but I know that it was not in my own power.
Sure.
And so how all that works all the time, I don't know. But I know that's what happened then. And so the Lord was certainly in front and out ahead, leading us. And that 23rd Psalm,
Mhm.
it was food for the soul,
Mm-hmm.
through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. You're with me.
Yeah.
And he demonstrated that.
Yeah. And you mentioned almost not knowing precisely how how that process works, where you can, I don't know, where you can have almost an exceptional measure of grace to give others
Yeah.
that far exceeds what otherwise you feel like you might be able to put together
There's no doubt.
in the moment. Yeah, I I think it's fair to see that as maybe an expression of God's grace. I think you'd be you, I think you'd be able to agree with that too,
For sure.
just
For
based on
sure.
what I know we've talked about in the past.
Right.
Yeah. Well, John, in your estimation, what is what's the impact of not being able to deal with the tragedy of the tornadoes like you would have otherwise had COVID not hit? You've hinted at that a little bit, but let's dig into that for a little, if you don't mind.
Yeah. For me, I think um, it stunted dealing with grief
Mhm.
appropriately, maybe. And I might not mean what you think I mean um, by that. I think in the church so often we are so quick to redeem things, and that's because we're redeemed people.
Of course.
We believe in redemption. We practice redemption. At least we should.
Mhm.
We've been redeemed for those of us that have decided to trust and follow after Jesus and been immersed and covered in His blood and all
Yep.
that. But one of the greatest lessons, and I want to freely admit this to you, I didn't know this a year ago. A year ago today, I did not know this, but walking through what we've walked through and with whom we've walked has taught me that we don't always have to redeem things. The Lord redeems things.
Mhm.
And what I mean by that is we don't always have to say, well, this was really bad, but look at all this good.
Yeah.
Look at all the good that has happened. And I think because we've not been able to be together, the temptation, and I mean that on purpose, I mean to use that word, the temptation to just kind of gloss over some of that loss has been especially potent.
Mm.
And so there's no doubt that the Lord is good. There's no doubt that God's name has been praised in ways that maybe wouldn't have been, had these experiences not occurred. But we still grieve and we still mourn. And there's a reason why so many lament psalms don't offer a resolution at the end. They just say, we don't like the way that it is, but we trust you. And
Yeah.
that's as much as we can say right now. And there's something to grieving like that I think we rob ourselves of, to sit in the space where I don't have it all figured out. I don't know what to make of all of this, but God, help me trust you more. Help me see the way you see. Your ways are above my ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. There's something quite powerful in turning your own heart and your own experience over to the Lord in a way that maybe you wouldn't have had a disaster or tragedy not happened.
Mhm.
There's something powerful that church leaders, that ministers, that preachers, that elders, that deacons can lead their people in if they'll just sit and rest and trust, but not have to resolve everything.
Yeah. You mentioned this last time when we were talking. Just kind of run through some of the things that we wanted to talk about. This is a direct quote from you. And maybe this is another one of those kinds of instances where you might not remember this, but this was just a couple of weeks ago, so I'm not going to let you off the hook that easily. You said, "Let lament be lament. You don't have to resolve it." Let lament be lament.
It's
You don't
true.
have to resolve it.
You don't have to resolve it. I don't know if it's our fellowship, if it's Churches of Christ, or if it's the American experience. I happen to believe it's the latter, more so than the former. We don't lament, not for long.
Mm-hmm.
We might lament, but by the time that closing prayer happens, it better be resolved. You better have the invitation offered and the good news.
Sing and be happy today.
That's right. And there is something unnatural about grieving and lament. And listen, it doesn't just have to be a tragedy.
Right.
It can be a personal failure. It can be some situation that happens within a church body. It can be a death. I mean, there are a lot of ways that it can manifest itself. But if you've spent any amount of time in church, if you're watching this or listening to this, you've sat through a service on a Sunday that you remember that just felt different.
Mm-hmm.
And because some news was shared, some event has occurred. And to stand up at the end of that service and sing and be happy, or count your many blessings, or
which are good songs,
which are fantastic songs,
which are good songs. Okay. Right.
And we believe those songs.
Yeah.
But to sing those songs on that day, listen, let lament be lament.
Yeah.
Just lament and end with, Lord, we need you. We need you. There's something powerful in that space.
I think so. I've been in church services before where someone came either confessing grave sin or just weeping because they were broken at a diagnosis,
sure,
or something along those lines, and it felt right to stop and sit and just be with them, rather than maybe continuing with the same set list that we had.
That's exactly right.
I'm not a worship minister, so
me either. But I will say, Kevin, I believe, on a philosophical level, maybe, and certainly on a theological one, that to just sit and to not offer an explanation for why actually demonstrates more trust in God.
I can see that.
And I want to be on that side.
Yeah.
Always I want to be on the side of demonstrating more trust to God.
Yeah.
In God. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that struck me this year, there are a lot of things, and I've shared many of those already, but the friends of Job, they sit with him, and there's, they go back and forth, and each offers an explanation for why Job endured what he endured. Throughout that whole book, every single person who offers an explanation for why other than God is wrong. Mm-hmm. Every one of them, other than God, is wrong in some way.
Sure.
Or until God's spokesman shows up, and
they've clearly missed the whole picture.
That's right. And so just be slow to offer an explanation. I guess that would be my practical advice. Be slow to offer an explanation for why things happen, and just say, God, we need you. I think we demonstrate trust. We demonstrate trust in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. That kind of trust is, like you said, pretty radical when it when it can come from a place of hurt, confusion,
Yeah.
justifiable anger at what has happened. And yet still there's this thought that comes out and says, despite all of this, we will trust.
Mm-hmm.
We will still affirm your goodness. Yeah. John, you said that we're about y'all are about to have the 1 year memorial. 1 year later, what do you want other people to know about what y'all have been through and what you're still going through?
We would covet your prayers. The power of prayer cannot be overstated. And I thought about that question, Kevin, a lot because, and I knew I was going to respond in that way. And I know it's cliche. And I hate that it's cliche,
Mm-hmm.
but the reason that it's cliche is because it is inherently true.
Yeah.
And the power of prayer is sustaining. It's remarkable the number of contacts that we had in March and April of last year from all over the world. Certainly people donated financially and donated with their time and their skilled labor and cleaning things up in our community and all those ways. And we appreciate all those, profoundly appreciate all those gifts. It was also the notes that we received in the mail, the text messages that I received from preachers in this area, even outside of our fellowship, that just dropped a note and said, "Hey, we are praying for you. I am praying for you right now."
Mm-hmm.
And we would ask that you continue to do that for our church family. But we weren't the only folks affected. Like you mentioned, there were places in Nashville and
Sure.
places in Chattanooga
Mm-hmm.
that also had quite a bit of damage and some tragedy of their own. And so we would certainly covet your prayers for us, and would ask that you continue to be faithful in that.
Yeah. When we were talking about this earlier, to kind of get this meeting set up, I had mentioned that it seems like y'all have learned how to lament more fully, more completely. You talked a little bit about that. It seems like lament allows us to maybe allows us to be honest in a way that otherwise we might be tempted not to be, because like we've been saying, it does come from a place of pain and confusion and sometimes anger. But if you've learned how to lament well, like the lament psalms especially direct us to do, we've been able to give ourselves language, I think, for how we can talk to God in that, in those times. Otherwise, we might not be able to gain that kind of language.
Well, I think one of the things, I love how you said that. It gives us language. I think the danger in not lamenting in that way, in the way that the psalmist does, in as much as we can, is when we feel that way, and we will. If you live long enough, you're going to have an experience where you're going to need to lament. And if you don't have the language of lament, you're not going to know what to do with those feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not going to know where to place that anger. And so I would say, in the church, much of the time, anger misplaced, if you trace that back far enough, it's because they've not had language to put their feelings to.
Wow.
And so
Yeah.
it's misdirected.
Mm-hmm.
And misdirected anger is always dangerous. And so I think lament gives us not only the opportunity to begin the healing process, because it roots us in the trust of God, but it also helps us practically deal with some of those things so we don't misdirect so much at our brothers and sisters. And that's especially important in the American context, again, because we need a solution every Sunday. And we need 4 steps every Sunday. And if the preacher didn't give us 4 steps, then we didn't really have church. And it's just not so. I've really paid attention. I'm in my daily Bible reading this year. My oldest son and I are following a plan that we've never followed before, and we are reading 1 psalm a day alongside of everything, the chronological plan that you kind of have seen before, but there's 1 psalm attached to it every day. And I really paid attention. So, we're like 57, 58 psalms in. I've really paid attention to the context of the psalm and tried to contextualize that in as much as I could. It's the first time in my life I've ever read 1 psalm a day, every day. And so to pay attention to the context and to know much of the time what David is facing as he is lamenting.
Yeah.
And then to know the overarching story of David, that he always kind of circles back to trust in God, has been very remarkable. Like, if you do nothing else in the midst of tragedy as a leader personally, if you do nothing else other than before you go to sleep at night on any given day and tell the Lord, I don't know what to do with all this. I need you and I trust you. You've done enough.
Mm-hmm.
Not only will it help you trust him more, but it will help you not misdirect your anger.
I had never thought about one of the negative consequences of not lamenting being misdirecting your anger. For those who are very kind enough to listen to this, you do not have to be in ministry very long before you realize that misdirected anger is something that ministers of all shapes and sizes, not just preaching ministers, but really church leaders, elders, deacons, etc. Misdirected anger is something that is just a reality that we face as working with churches. I was dialoguing with that sounds so formal. I was talking. I was talking with a friend the other day about a situation, and they said that they have noticed that almost 100% of the time, the problem is not the problem. The problem that excites someone's anger or frustration with you as a minister is often the last straw, when they have been carrying a load of other things unseen to us.
That's right.
And and you just happen to be the last straw. You happen to be the one that that sets off the spark. And John, I think that really does make a lot of sense, that if we had the language of lament, if it was natural to us, right? Okay, so the language of praise comes almost naturally to Christians, because especially if you've been going to church all your life, which you and I have, not all of the the audience will, but for those who have gone to church, that's almost your native language.
Sure.
But we've got to be bilingual, at least bilingual, to be as fluent in lament as we are in praise. And if we just don't have any, capability of lamenting, then we're left with nothing better to do than to present ourselves as if we always have it together.
That's right.
I don't know if those strings, if I was able to tie those strings together well enough, but does that make sense?
Yeah, there's no doubt. It makes complete sense. And the minister is typically one of the more visible people. Is a lot of folks misdirect their anger at God, and they feel like they can't get to God, and so they're going to take it out on his people.
Sure.
And in their mind, it's going to be one of the ministers, one of the elders, one of the deacons, somebody in leadership. And that creates a domino effect, because not only now, if you trace this, not only does a lack of having a language of lament lead to misdirected anger never exists in a vacuum.
Right.
And so then it will, go outward and infect other people. And so there will certainly be collateral damage relationally. And again, if you trace that far enough back, I like the term becoming bilingual. I like that idea, having a vocabulary of praise, but also a language of lament. It undergirds our faith. And listen, I've lived long enough to know that there are a lot of smart, well-intentioned, good people who don't know Jesus in the world, who, when they hear a pat church answer for why bad things happen, they're not buying it. And so lament is a better way to go all the way around.
Yeah.
For non-believers, for believers, it's a better way to go. But there's always going to be collateral damage. And you trace that far enough back, it's going to be misdirected anger attached to not lamenting.
Fascinating. Yeah. John, as we kind of wrap up with our time together this afternoon, is there anything else that you want to mention? I did ask, a year later, what do we need to know? Is there anything else that you want to mention to kind of tie a bow on this conversation? And if there are other ways that folks can still help, what are some of those ways maybe as well?
Yeah. Just keep praying for us. And we would appreciate that. I will share one other lesson just real quick, that has become very personal to me, and I don't remember where I heard it. It's one of those deals. I heard it around a year ago, around the storm. Honestly, the best I can remember, I think it was a newscaster that I did an interview with, a reporter with a station in Nashville that I did with, that we kind of were talking back and forth, and led me to this thought. We don't move on, but we do move forward. And that has been something that probably a phrase that I've thought of every day, every single day since March the 3rd of last year. And we don't move on from the people that we lost. We don't move on from all of that, but we do move forward in faith. We don't forget. One of my Old Testament exegesis professors on the undergraduate level talked about the story of Job, and said he was preaching from the story of Job, and one time, and somebody, maybe it was a Bible class, I guess, and somebody in the Bible class, kind of commented at the end, well, God gave Job all of his kids back, or he gave him more children than he had the first go round. And he was like, yeah, but he still lost his kids. And
was it a student who said that?
I won't tell you who.
Oh, okay.
Probably
I don't need to know, but yeah. It feels like somebody who's not a parent or
100%.
was not a parent at that point said that.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
But his point was well taken. Again, it's easy to gloss over the pain to get to the prize.
Yeah.
And Job still he still had children that he put in the ground.
Yeah.
And so I believe Job is not a mythical man, not a legend. Is a real person with real emotion and real experiences that the world has been telling, for thousands of years. And Job did not move on from the memory of his children, did not move on from the experiences that he had in the past, but he did move forward with the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a subtlety there, and you could squabble about some of the vocabulary, but the subtlety that exists in my mind between moving on and moving forward is certainly worth understanding.
Yeah.
And certainly worth walking in.
Yeah. And that's something that I know y'all are daily demonstrating. Not moving on, but moving forward. Yeah.
That's what we try to do, for sure.
Agreed. Well, John, I really appreciate you taking some time to talk with me about these experiences. There's just a host of other things and other people that we could talk with, but a year later, I know that some healing has taken place, but some of those wounds are still there, and it might take a lifetime for some of those wounds to heal.
Certainly.
I had mentioned my parents near the beginning of this broadcast, and my parents weren't the only family members affected. As you're very good friends with one of my brothers, and so we're aware of a lot of what has happened, and it was pretty fascinating to see, like you said, just the international concern that was expressed for so many. They're in Cookeville and in the Middle Tennessee area as well. But John, I appreciate you sharing with us. I appreciate your insight, especially into God's grace that I think you would say that otherwise you might not have gained.
No doubt.
If there is, I don't think silver lining is the appropriate term, but that in God's grace, we can still find ways to heal and grow and be redeemed.
Amen.
Even in terrible situations like this.
So, God's not going to waste any of our experience or yours.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, John, hope you have a good rest of the day, sir. Really appreciate you spending some time with us. I have enjoyed our conversation. Definitely given me a lot to think about, and this might be something that we return to at some point, maybe next year or some other time. Kind of developing this idea of the language of lament, and how that can be useful for us. So, John, glad to have you with us on the podcast, sir. And don't be a stranger. And maybe we'll be able to get to another time here in the near future.
Thank you, brother. We appreciate you. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.